Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 652. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about mountains and sand dunes and glaciers, brown bears and fjords, and a copper mine as we go to the national parks of Alaska. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about Alaska. I'd like to welcome back to the show Gary Arndt from everything-everywhere.com, the most frequent Amateur Traveler guest, I am pretty sure. This is, we believe, Gary's 15th episode, the last one being the Liberation Route, and I won't try and name them all anymore. We're no longer just doing the small places, which Gary and I did for the longest time. In fact, you've come to talk to us about the largest state in the United States.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Alaska's national parks, and in particular, the 8 sites of the 24 sites in the state of Alaska that have a national park designation.
And just to make sure that that makes sense to people, within the National Park Service, there is national parks, which is what we're going to talk about, national monuments, national historic sites, national historic parks, national seashores, national grasslands, etc.
Yeah, and sometimes the difference between one of those things and another is very small. Like Grand Canyon National Park used to be Grand Canyon National Monument.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. A lot of them work that way because national monument status can be conferred by the president. And then it later gets changed into a park by Congress. So that recently happened just last week when Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore got upgraded to Indiana Dunes National Park by an act of Congress.
Okay. And last year was the Pinnacles National Monument turned into Pinnacles National Park, or maybe it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, that was a while ago, but that was the same thing, National Monument. Okay. And there are other sites in Alaska very similar to some of the places we're talking about, but they're just never got put with the label National Park.
Excellent. So why don't we just jump in? What kind of itinerary are we going to need to see all 8?
You're going to need to get on some floatplanes. You're going to need to get on some boats. And you're going to need to drive a little bit. The parks really are different, and visiting these parks is very different than what you're going to do if you want to visit other parks in the United States. Getting to the parks in the rest of the United States, even Hawaii, even American Samoa for that matter, is not really that hard.
Right.
If you want to go, you just get in a car and you go there. Even like Isle Royale and some of these other ones, not really super difficult. Alaska is a completely different ball of wax because so many of these parks are very remote and you can't drive there. So you will have to put in more effort and spend a little bit more money to get to some of these parks.
And I assume you're going to tell us why it's worth it.
Yeah, because these parks really are amazing, and you're going to have an experience there like you don't have really in almost any of the other parks. We might as well start with the most remote ones and the least visited parks. And these are the two that are above the Arctic Circle. Kobuk Valley National Park and Gates of the Arctic National Park. And to give you an idea, if you look at the official statistics, it will say that Gates of the Arctic, I think, gets 10,000 visitors a year. And there is absolutely no way that is possible. None whatsoever. Because I think what they did, because I actually went and researched this. There was a couple years ago where it got like nothing, then it jumps to 10,000, and then it kind of went back. What happened was the visitor center for Gates of the Arctic National Park is not in the park.
Okay.
It's outside the park. There are no roads going to the park. There's no visitor center, no facilities of any sort inside the park. There's no campgrounds, no signs, no trails, no garbage cans, nothing. It is a wilderness area as pure as what you're going to find anywhere in the United States. What they do is they measure people going to a visitor center, which was open on the Dalton Highway. And they had bus trips that would go up this road and stop at the visitor center. But they weren't actually visiting the park.
Okay.
So to get to Gates of the Arctic National Park, and it's a really stunning park. It's named after a series of mountains that were basically called the Gates of the Arctic from a very early explorer. There's two ways you can get to both Gates of the Arctic and Kobuk Valley, and you're going to have to fly there. So the way I did it is I flew into the town of Bettles, Alaska, which is just north of the Arctic Circle. And then from there, you can get on a flight to both of the parks, actually. So what I did is I used a company called Brooks Range Aviation, which runs out of Bettles. And Bettles is basically just a big float plane base. So there's lots of bush planes that are there. And they offer a deal where you can visit both Gates of the Arctic and Kobuk Valley in one day. You will do a landing. You will actually physically visit the park. And you really get to see some amazing scenery. And your options for visiting these parks are basically you can do it in a day trip by airplane, or you're going to spend 2 weeks hiking or rafting. And there's really nothing in between. So when I started this out by saying like the number of visitors is way overrated, when I was at the park office in Bettles and I got to meet some of the rangers, I asked them, well, how many do you think? And they said on the basis of the number of bear boxes they have to give out to people entering the park, they felt that it was probably about 800 visitors a year to Gates of the Arctic and maybe 200 a year that went to Kobuk Valley. Which seems to make a lot more sense because it's not an easy place to get to.
Well, and you were talking about hiking versus taking the plane. The other thing is the scale of these parks. As I look at the stats for this in terms of total number of acres, we're talking about Gates of the Arctic is over 8 million acres, which means it's larger than Maryland, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island. Not combined, but than all of those states. So
yeah, I mean, these places are just huge. And what's interesting is when you go into Gates of the Arctic, normally your advice in a park is stay on the trails, right? Because they don't want you tramping around destroying things. In Gates of the Arctic, their advice is just the opposite. They don't want you walking in a single file line. They want you walking abreast.
Because it's tundra?
Right, because you're so far north that the plant life grows really, really slow.
Okay.
So if everyone were to walk in a straight line, everyone's footprints hitting the same spot would basically kill everything that you're walking on. So if you walk abreast, it's just one step that everyone's taking, and that the impact of that's not very much. But yeah, it's a fantastic place. In a lot of ways, to be real honest, the views flying there is almost a better experience because you're going to be able to experience the park in a far different way than you're going to be able to do on foot. And for a lot of people, if they have a goal of visiting all 61 national parks, and we do have 61 now, This is usually the last ones that they visit, the Arctic parks.
And so some people have a goal of visiting all of the sites in the national park system. That's a much larger number, and I don't remember what that number is right now.
It is 418 as of this recording.
Okay.
And I should add, the number of people who've done that is, I think it's less than 50. And I believe there are like half as many people that have been to every National Park Service site as have been to every country in the world. So it's a hard thing to do, just because you get some of the sites like Anichak National Monument in Alaska is the least visited site in the park system. And that gets maybe 100 people a year. And that's primarily because, again, you have to fly in and the weather prevents a lot of the flights.
Oh,
so
sure.
There's a very good chance if they drop you off to stay overnight, it might be a week before they pick you up.
Now, do they do a usual route when you're doing these fly-ins?
Yeah, sort of. I think there are certain lakes that they stop in.
Okay.
So the other park that's up there is Kobuk Valley National Park. That's the one that really doesn't. And what makes Kobuk Valley famous are the sand dunes. And a lot of people are saying, well, I didn't know there were sand dunes north of the Arctic Circle. And there are. These are the northernmost sand dunes in the world. Most of the flights to Kobuk Valley will usually land on the sand, or they will land close to the sand. When I went, we actually landed on the river pretty close, and we did several flyovers of the dunes. But that's really the primary attraction of the park are the sand dunes. To get to Kobuk Valley, so I went to both parks and landed in both parks from Bettles. It's east of both of the parks, south and east of the parks. The other way you can get there is through Kotzebue, Alaska, and that's on the west side. And from Kotzebue, you can also, that's closer to Kobuk Valley. You can also visit Cape Krusenstern National Monument, Bering Straits National Monument, and Noatak National Preserve, which actually connects these two national parks. So there's 5 National Park Service sites up in this northern Alaska region.
And do the others stand out for any particular feature? You mentioned the sand dunes in the Kobuk Valley.
The mountains in Gates of the Arctic are really the big thing.
Sure. Yeah. No, I was seeing that from the pictures. Yeah.
Yeah, the Brooks Range.
And when we say the mountains, we're talking about jagged mountains with snow and gorgeous alpine lakes and things like that.
Yeah, the Brooks Range. And a lot of people never see the Brooks Range because it's so far north. It's north of the Arctic Circle. The other National Park Service sites tend to be kind of flat and marshy. They don't have nearly the kind of topography that you're going to get. They tend to be kind of more national preserves than anything else.
So more about the wildlife than the scenery.
Right.
Okay.
To be honest, I think they could just lump them all together in one park and it wouldn't make a difference because they don't get any visitors. And the management of the park is pretty straightforward because you don't have to take entrance fees or check the campgrounds or make sure that the bookstore is stocked. It's a very simple thing to run because it's all over this area.
Okay.
So those are the 2 parks north of the Arctic Circle. Now there are 2 parks that are kind of like in central Alaska. And these are the 2 parks that you can access by car, one of which is really well known, and that's Denali National Park.
Sure.
That's the most visited park in Alaska. If you do an Alaska cruise, that will usually be a part of it. You will take the train usually from Anchorage up to Denali. You will stay. It's a fantastic park. And if you haven't been there, the defining thing about the park is, of course, Mount Denali, which is where it gets its name, which is the highest point in North America. Interesting fact, only 30% of the visitors to the park ever actually see the mountain.
Because the mountain only comes out about 30% of the time?
Right, because it's covered in clouds.
Yeah.
But that's interesting when juxtaposed with the fact that 50% of the people that attempt to climb the mountain are successful. So if you attempt to climb the mountain, you have better odds than just showing up and seeing it.
Okay.
There is one road into the park, one single road, and that road is 90 miles long. With one notable exception, you cannot drive your car down the road. So there are buses that you can get in at the visitor center, and they will take you to different spots up and down the road. You can get out, whether it's a campground, a picnic area, or you can take it all the way to the end and then all the way back. What I did is I actually stayed at Camp Denali, which is a lodge inside the park, which was actually outside the park at one point. And then in 1980, when Jimmy Carter expanded a whole bunch of the Park Service land in Alaska, it basically got swallowed up by the park and grandfathered in. Okay. So they are able to run a lodge right inside the park. I highly, highly, highly recommend it if anyone wants to do a proper trip to Denali. It is almost out to the 90-mile marker. So it's really almost at the end of the line.
And so that's 90 miles from the main highway into the park road?
From the visitor center, yeah.
From the visitor center, okay.
Yeah, and they'll have a bus that will come and get you. You put your stuff on it. They drive you out there. And then the drive there, I mean, you're not going super fast because you're in a national park, but you are going to stop many times because of wildlife. You're going to see caribou. You might see a moose, a grizzly bear. We saw all those things a couple times. So you're going to see a lot of wildlife. So just the process of even getting to the lodge will take you quite a while. But staying deep into the park like that is a fantastic experience. And you have to sign up for it really early. So we are recording this in March of 2019.
Right.
And I would be willing to bet that everything is already booked up for the summer. So you really need to act quick. Yeah.
I'm assuming from the descriptions of your trip so far that so far everything you've done has been in summertime.
Yes. These parks, for the most part, are not open in the winter. They're just not. So there's no public services if you were to go there. And quite frankly, they have no idea who's entering the park. I mean, really?
It's a pretty big place.
Yeah, they're federal lands, and there's certain things you're not supposed to do, but they don't know. And I said, so it's a 90-mile road. You have to take a bus with one notable exception. And that is at the end of the season every year, and I think it's in September, they have a road lottery. And the road lottery, I forget when it starts, but basically you enter a lottery, and if you win, you can drive your car down the road. And I think they have like a 2 or 3 day window where you can do that. And one of my friends, and you know her as well, Amy, who used to work for me, actually won the road lottery one year and rented a car and went and did it. Yeah, if you want to do it on your own, I'd considered even doing it. Going and renting like a Jeep Wrangler and then hooking up like a massive telephoto lens to the top. And so just to drive down it like it's a machine gun turret or something, be able to photograph wildlife from a platform like that, I think would be fantastic.
That would be more fun to be photographing the caribou than the grizzly bear like that. But
anything. I'm not picky. Denali is going to be the one park people are most familiar with.
Right.
It's the most accessible because it's connected by a road. The other park, which is connected by road, doesn't get nearly as many visitors, but it really should because it's an amazing park. It is the largest national park in the park system, and it's also a World Heritage Site, and that is Wrangell St. Elias National Park.
Oh, I didn't know it was a World Heritage Site. Okay. Yeah, Wrangell St. Elias, and we've talked about it on the show with an episode that we did with Gary Arndt. So some people have already heard about it and seen photos of it, and I agree that it's gorgeous looking. Yeah, I knew it was the largest. I did not know it was a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
It is a World Heritage Site together with Glacier Bay.
Oh, I do remember that. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Kluane National Park in the Yukon, and then a provincial park I can't pronounce in British Columbia. So this whole ice field area, it's the biggest non-polar ice field in the world. And Mount Logan, just on the Canadian side of the border, is there. That's the highest point in Canada. And there's a couple of reality shows which have actually been shot there. So the primary focus of the park is in the center of the park, and that's McCarthy, Alaska.
Right.
It's a very small community.
Old mining town.
Correct. And the roads there aren't even paved. And when I visited, it was just before the Adventure Travel World Summit, which was held a few years ago in Anchorage. And we were there the last weekend it was open. Like the park was open. So all of the hotels and the restaurants were shutting down and there was hardly anybody there. And they had a big bonfire in the street and they got rid of all of the food and the alcohol that they needed to get rid of for the end of the season. And they just had a really big party. A couple of things that going to McCarthy are really worth doing is that this is the one part of the Alaska National Parks which has a cultural component. And that is the Kennecott copper mine. The copper mine at one point was by far the biggest source of copper in the world. I want to say in the early 20th century. The ore there had a uniquely high amount of copper in it. And the mine, this massive wooden structure that was built in the early 20th century is all still there. They shut the mine down, I think, in the 1960s, and they just pretty much left everything. It wasn't worth their time to get rid of it. So they run tours there. The Park Service facility is in some of the old management buildings for the mine. And what's also very close by is the Root Glacier. And so this is a glacier which comes right down near the town of Kennecott, which is where the mine was, and the nearby town of McCarthy, which is like a mile away, where everyone stays. And you can go hiking on the glacier. We did that. We spent the day hiking. They give you crampons and you can go out ice hiking. Really fun experience. And like I said, with the other parks, the one thing you probably also want to do is do a flight seeing tour.
Sure.
They offer these flights out of McCarthy because this park is so unfathomably large. I mean, it's bigger than Switzerland. So that's the scale we're talking about. And the ice fields, if you really want to see them, it's either days of hiking on a glacier or you get in an airplane.
Right.
And you have to do that.
Well, and I've done the flight over on the Canadian side of that, and it's just stunning. In fact, we landed on the Hubbard Glacier, which we talked about on the Yukon episode of the show, and which is amazing too. Now, I'm curious with the glacier hiking. I have not done it. I've certainly heard people talk about it. Other than wearing 2 pairs of socks or something to keep your feet warm, tell me more about what is glacier hiking like.
I've done it a couple times, actually. I've done it in Alaska. I've done it in Argentina as well. If you do it in the summer, it's not really that bad in terms of temperature. Yes, you're on ice, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, it's not that cold. It's not like it's in the middle of winter. Yeah,
no, I've been on the Athabasca Glacier, but we were just out in the big vehicles, which you've seen up there, and not doing a lot of hiking. Hiking, my understanding is there are crevasses. You need to go with somebody who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, that's true. They have guides and they have routes that they follow, and there are certain things you're going to avoid certain cracks in the ice and things like that. There are several times where we were really close to one and you could look down the hole and it's like a bottomless pit. The glacier itself.
Ah, bon chien. Bonjour, je suis Theo, a tour leader with Explore. And this is Punti. He's helping us find truffles under the trees next to this beautiful vineyard. Maybe for tomorrow's cooking class? Oui, call semi-on heure. Parfait. Semi-on o'clock. Not everyone gets to enjoy a Bordeaux sunset this way, but you will if you explore. No, Punti. Search exploreworldwide.com and don't just travel. Explore.
So evidently they had a reunion because this was an actual town. Some of the children who grew up in McCarthy and Kennecott came back decades later, and some of them started crying because they could see the mountains on the other side of the glacier, and they could never see that when they grew up because the glacier was so tall that they could never see beyond the glacier. And now you can actually see over the glacier, to give you an idea of how much it's cut back in size. But even driving there's going to be things that you'll see. If you look at a map, it's an odd patchwork parts of the park. So it's a very large park, but then parts of it near the road, like a patchwork of public and private land. There are still people that own some cabins that are surrounded by national park. And I think like the park system has a dibs on some of them. So if it ever gets sold or something like that, the Park Service can buy it. But for the most part, again, like with the land or with the parks above the Arctic Circle, it is a lot of wilderness with the exception of a main road that runs through the park and the town of McCarthy.
Okay.
So we've looked at 2 parks above the Arctic Circle, the 2 parks that are kind of in central Alaska, the ones that are connected by road. And now there are 2 other parks which are sort of on the Cook Inlet. And so the Cook Inlet, if you look at a map of Alaska, if you know where Anchorage is at the very end of the Cook Inlet. And then there's an arm, the Alaskan Peninsula, which is, if you keep extending it out, it becomes the Aleutian Islands.
Right.
So there are 2 parks in there, and they are Lake Clark National Park and Katmai National Park. Lake Clark is another not very visited park, but both of these parks you can actually reach from Anchorage. I went to both of them through flights from Anchorage. There are quasi day trip options available, especially if you're going to Lake Clark. Lake Clark is a pretty big park.
Not by Alaska standards, but...
No, but by national park standards.
Sure.
The place I went to is called Chinita Bay, which is right on the Cook Inlet, and it's famous in the summer for being able to watch brown bears. And you can get really close to brown bears, and there are a lot of them. I was quite shocked at how close we got. For the most part, they don't really care about the humans. They're eating sedge grass, and they just basically spend most of their time grazing. But you'll see them stand up every so often. Sometimes you'll see them in the mud flats at low tide, and they will actually dig up clams and mussels. It was actually really interesting seeing that behavior because they'll just walk around in these really muddy paws, sometimes fighting with other bears.
And this is at Katmai?
No, this is Lake Clark.
Oh, okay, because I didn't think Lake Clark went all the way out to the bay from the map I'm looking at.
No, it does. I think I know the map you're looking at if you're looking at like Google Maps.
Yeah, I am.
Yes, it does not show that. But if you go to the National Park Service site map, you'll notice that it does actually go all the way to the coast.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah, and there's a lodge very close to this area in Chinita Bay called Bear Mountain Lodge. And it's this tiny little sliver of private land surrounded by national park. I assume that this also got grandfathered in when the park was created. And there you can stay. They have the planes land right on the beach. They have a very wide beach that's pretty smooth. That's where we landed. And you can also do this as a day trip. It's pretty easy to fly in from Anchorage, go see bears for most of the day, and then fly back to Anchorage where you can be at night.
Now, I'm assuming in terms of budget, we're not talking hosteling kind of budgets to do the fly-in or to stay at a lodge like this. We're doing a little more high-end. How more expensive is that?
You're going to be looking at, it depends is the answer. But the Lake Clark flight is relatively cheap compared to going to, say, Kobuk Valley or Gates of the Arctic. I think you're looking at about $500
per person.
Possibly. Usually the planes are done on a per plane basis. So the more people you can put on because their costs are not necessarily related to the number of people on the plane.
Sure.
It's not a regularly scheduled flight. So on a per person basis, it's going to be a lot easier if you can get 3 or 4 people in the plane than if you're trying to do it solo.
Okay.
I've been looking at visiting some of the parks in northern Canada, which are way harder to visit than any of these parks we're talking about in Alaska. And it's the same thing, that if I can get a few people to do it, it'll cut my cost in half or a third, just because it's all done on a per flight basis, not necessarily per person. Okay. The other place that a lot of people fly into is Port Ellsworth, which is in the Lake Clark National Preserve, which is right next to Lake Clark National Park. And a lot of these the Alaska parks, just as kind of a footnote, there's a park and a preserve. So there's Denali National Park and Preserve. And this is a common thing. And basically, it's kind of all the same. Legally, there are 2 different units in the park system, but they're managed, operated. Everything's done as one. The only difference is, I think, the activities you can engage in the preserve, some hunting rights, fishing, things like that. Okay. For the most part, it's all just one thing, and they're referred to as Lake Clark National Park and Preserve.
Okay, got it.
Port Ellsworth is a tiny little community that's based on Lake Clark itself, and you can fly in there, and then there's camping options and things like that. And we talked about Chariot before. I'm pretty sure when she visited Lake Clark, she actually flew further inland than what I did, whereas I was just on the coast.
Okay. Yeah, we didn't talk to her about that part of her trip. We did talk about Wrangell St. Elias, but on the episode we did with her, we did a couple more remote places in Alaska that were not national parks. Yeah, like I think she went up to Nome and visited the Bering Strait National Monument, places like that. Yep, exactly. The other park, which is a little bit further down the peninsula, is Katmai National Park. What's interesting is the reason why people go to Katmai today is totally different than the reason why the park was created. The people go today to see bears. Right. So the brown bear feeding, there's a waterfall on the Brooks River, and basically bears hang out there in the summer and they eat salmon. They just do that all day long because there's sunlight and they get fat in the winter, and you can just photograph them eating salmon. And that's what we did. If you've ever seen a picture of a bear fishing for salmon at a waterfall, I would bet there's a 90% chance it was taken at this one exact spot in Katmai National Park. Right. And they have a viewing area set up. They have like a wooden deck where people can set up their cameras. And that by far is the biggest attraction. And I should note, compared to, with the exception of Denali and Wrangell St. Elias, Katmai actually has facilities for people. So they have cabins that are available. They have yurts that are available. And when you fly in, so you can actually stay there overnight. They have a dining hall. So you can do an extended stay there where you can't really do that in Lake Clark and the Arctic parks. You are going to fly there from Anchorage to the town of King Salmon, Alaska. And then from King Salmon, you will get a connecting flight in a float plane to Katmai. And that's a pretty short trip. Okay. Getting to King Salmon is the major part of it. King Salmon, coincidentally, I mentioned Anichak National Monument, which is the least visited site in the park system. That's how you would get there as well. Anichak is a dormant volcano, and basically you can fly inside the caldera. Imagine if like Crater Lake in
Oregon had a big notch carved out of it, and you could fly in and land on a lake inside the volcano. That's what Anichak is like.
Interesting. And that's further down the peninsula, it looks like.
Yes, and it's way harder to get to. But you would go to King Salmon as well if you wanted to get there. Now, the biggest volcanic eruption of the 20th century occurred here, and most people have never heard of it. It was Mount Nova Rupta, which is kind of close to Mount Katmai, but technically it was Nova Rupta, and it erupted in June of 1912, which was only a few months after a certain very large boat sank in the Atlantic Ocean after it hit an iceberg. And the news of that year was kind of dominated by the Titanic. And the fact is there weren't a lot of people in this part of Alaska. And so when this eruption happened, a lot of people just didn't know about it. No one, they don't think, actually died from the eruption because no one lived quite close to it, although there were some villages that had to be evacuated and eventually abandoned. And I guess all of Kodiak Island was covered by like a foot of ash. And to give you an idea, ash is anywhere from 2 to 10 times more heavy than snow. That could collapse buildings if that got on there.
Now, I'm guessing from the name of it that this is a volcano that they named at that time, that this was a new volcano. Because, I mean, literally, we're talking about new eruption, right? In Latin is what they named the place. And it does look like that's the case. A volcano that was formed in 1912.
Or very close to it, yeah. I just don't think they had a lot of geologists running around there back then. So, but here's the interesting thing. So for those of us that remember Mount St. Helens,
right,
that was a pretty big explosion, right, when that happened in the early 80s. This explosion was 30 times larger. It would have filled a cube that would be 26 kilometers on each edge.
Now, the difference is, so Mount St. Helens, we remember it because it was a pyroclastic explosion eruption.
This was too.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. As versus with the volcanoes, for instance, in Hawaii, that tend to be lots of lava, but slowly over time. Okay, this blew up.
This is
like Krakatoa
like,
sort of thing.
Or the other comparable volcanic explosion in our lifetimes would have been Mount Pinatubo.
Sure.
The Philippines, and this was, again, many times larger than that. You'd have to go back to Krakatoa to have an explosion. And like I said, most people never have heard of this. So the park was created where this massive pyroclastic flow occurred. And today it's called the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. And they have trips that are there. You should definitely do it. Some fascinating formations, but it's just meters and meters and meters of what was mud that was ejected from this volcano and just filled up this entire valley. So that's why the park was created. Not really, the bears had nothing to do with it. That was just a lucky coincidence. It happened to be within a national park camp. It's the Valley of 10,000 Smokes, which was the reason for it. And the name basically came because when the first people came to the volcano to check it out after the eruption, I think the next year, there was still steam coming off of this area because there was still so much latent heat.
Well, and you were comparing it to Krakatoa. That is, as far as we know, that is the loudest known sound that has ever been made. It was heard 2,000 miles away. So to say that this was bigger than that is impressive.
There was actually an explosion in Indonesia bigger than Krakatoa that occurred earlier in the 19th century in Mount Tambora. But we just don't have as much documentation as we do for Krakatoa, which we have quite a bit.
Yeah.
And that was one of the problems with this explosion because it was in a corner of Alaska where there just wasn't many people. The people that whatever Anchorage was at the time, probably just a very small village, probably heard it. Like I said, there was a village that was evacuated and abandoned eventually and some of the people on Kodiak Island, but that was it. And so by the time the news of this got out, it was months later, I think.
Interesting.
So now we're down to the final two parks. And the way that people visit most of these parks is by water. So we've had parks you can drive to, parks you can fly to. Although technically, you got to put a little asterisk. You can drive to these parks in a technical sense. So one of the two parks is Kenai Fjords National Park.
Okay.
It is located outside of the town of Seward, Alaska, which is right on the coast. And so you can technically drive to part of it. There is a glacier called Exit Glacier. And there is a road just outside of Seward that you can take, and you can go to the foot of the glacier by car. And it's one of the only places you can actually do that in Alaska. The other place being the Mendenhall Glacier outside of Juneau, but that's not a National Park Service site.
Right.
Most of the people, however, are going to be visiting Kenai Fjords by boat. So in the town of Seward, there are regular boat trips. They usually leave in the morning. You would have some lunch, come back in the afternoon, that will kind of go up and down the park and explore it. And that's the standard way that most people do it. I actually did this as a day trip out of Anchorage. So when I was at the aforementioned Adventure Travel World Summit, we had a day where we kind of went on adventures, and I just kind of did my own. I said, well, I'm going to drive down to Seward. And that's what I did. I left really early in the morning, arrived in time for the boat to take off, got on the boat, spent the day doing that, and then drove back. I want to say it's about a 2-hour drive from Anchorage. So it's actually one of the more accessible parks in Alaska, insofar as you don't have to fly.
Well, and we do have a whole episode on the Kenai Peninsula, so if you're interested in doing that and want to do more while you're in the area, go listen to that episode as well. And then the last one is probably the best known one.
Glacier Bay National Park. And I'm guessing that 90% of the people who visit this park are doing it on a cruise ship.
I think that's a fair guess, yes.
As part of any Inside Passage tour, you are going to enter the park, and you'll take your ship up and then back down. And you'll see all the sights. That is not what I did. So when I said you could technically drive to this park, it is true. So the nearby town of Gustavus, Alaska, has a road that connects it to the park center. The park headquarters has their own hotel. It's like a national park lodge, like you see in other parks. They have a dining center, a restaurant, campgrounds. There are trails you can walk around, all near the visitor center, which is inside the park. The problem is the town of Gustavus is
you can't drive to Gustavus at all. Gustavus.
Right. You have to take a ferry to get there. It's not easy to do.
Right.
But there is technically a road. If you do the cruise ship option, just get a cruise that goes there. That's all there is to it. Any Alaska cruise will pretty much go to Glacier Bay. If you don't want that option, and I think there's a lot of reasons why you might want to not do that, you just basically get to Gustavus, which is what I did. There's a couple hotels and Airbnbs, guest houses in there, no big hotels or anything. And then the Park Service has smaller boats that go out on daily excursions up into Glacier Bay.
Oh, okay.
And the nice part about doing this is that you get closer to the glaciers than you can get on the big cruise ships.
Sure.
You're going to be able to see more. You're going to be able to go up more inlets that those larger ships can't do. All of the large cruise ships will have a ranger that will get on the ship. So they take a boat out, just like a pilot does when they enter a port. And then the ranger will be on the ship, and they will do a program on board telling people everything. And they do the same thing on the smaller ships. It's just that you have a smaller number of people on a smaller boat, and you're getting off and entering from the visitor center rather than just sailing in.
Well, and we've done another episode on this that was my travels, and that was the uncruise that I did from Juneau. That with the other advantages with the kind of smaller boats like that is you can actually spend the night in Glacier Bay. The big ships are not allowed to. Only 2 large ships are allowed per day in Glacier Bay, and they must leave by dusk. Basically. So we were able to eat our dinner sitting at the terminus glacier of Glacier Bay, or one of the terminus glaciers, and listen to the ice cracking, and it was a fascinating experience. And then also get off the boat and do bushwhacking and things like that you're not going to get that on a big ship experience. So if you want to have more time, then either do the independently through Gustavus or do the smaller expedition class ship.
Yeah, when I was there on the park boat that does this, we actually picked some kayakers. So there were places where they were scheduled to meet the ship and pick them up. We got their kayaks, brought them on board. So there are outfitters I know out of Gustavus that do these kayaking trips where you can go for several days kind of up the river or along it. And yeah, if you really want to experience this park, I would try to do it on a smaller ship. Whether you're doing an uncruise like you did, or whether you're going to go and stay in Gustavus and you get on one of the park ships, I think it's just going to give you a better experience than if you're on a massive 2,000 person ship.
One of the interesting things about this park is Glacier Bay, when it was discovered, wasn't much of a bay. It was more of a glacier. And within the lifetime of our country, this whole glacier system has melted in a marvelous pace in terms of how fast it has melted. And so when you go into some of these other inlets, you can still see land that is basically recovering from glaciation, because when a glacier passes through and then melts, there are no plants. There's basically no trees, no bushes, no anything. And then there's a series of plants that will grow as this turns back into a forested area. And so it's interesting to see this, which you can see better if you can get off the boat and go bushwhacking or something like that.
Yeah, I think I saw on a map that when Captain Cook was there, I think it was Captain Cook, that literally the glacier was almost out to the ocean.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the entire bay was basically filled in, and this was in the late 18th century, I want to say, like 1780s, around there. And it's basically just been retreating.
Yeah, I want to say when Mark Twain and John Muir were in that area, so that would again been late 1800s, it was about that also. Yeah, so it's stunning how fast these glaciers have melted. This is definitely one of those, see it now while it's still Glacier Bay and not just Bay.
One of the interesting things, if you look at a map, you'll find that the Canadian border is actually really close. There's an area where like the U.S. border is very thin.
Yeah.
Well, what's funny is that one of the glaciers keeps moving back, and I think it's only a couple hundred meters away to a point where Canada's going to have a brand new coastal area.
Oh,
because
funny.
it's eventually going to back up into Canada. Yeah. So
sure,
that's something they probably didn't think about when they drew the map, that could someday melt. And I mean, good luck getting there if you're Canadian, but that would technically be part of it. And as I mentioned, this is also part of the World Heritage Area. So Glacier Bay and Wrangell St. Elias are technically connected. But good luck trying to walk from one to the other because it's all mountains.
Yeah, it's a distance. So those are the 8 national parks. You mentioned a couple of the other sites within the national park system. Are there any other ones of those that you want to mention before we start wrapping up?
I mentioned the really neat ones up in the north.
Yep.
Anichek. There's the Charlie Yukon, Whiskey Charlie Yukoner. That's kind of in the eastern part, closer to the Yukon border. Not necessarily mountainous, more wooded. That's a national monument as well, or a national preserve, I'm sorry. Then there's some other bits on the Aleutian Island chain that are memorials to World War II, because that was the only place that actually saw combat in the United States, other than Pearl Harbor, of course, which saw action. But the Japanese actually took over some of the islands in the Aleutians. They didn't actually hold them that long because I think they realized it was kind of a waste. But the Klondike, or the gold mining, there's a dual Park Service site. One part of it is in Skagway, Alaska, and one part of it is in Seattle. Seattle was the jumping off point. People would get to Skagway. From Skagway, they would take the train up into the Yukon. And that's another really neat thing as well. I know some people on cruises, when they stop in Skagway, they actually are able to take the train through the pass. It is one of the most beautiful train rides in the world. Not technically part of the national park system, but still kind of part of that history of the gold mining and the gold rush and the whole Klondike thing.
Yeah, I've done that, but I've only done it up to the boundary from the Canadian side. And we talked about this in the Yukon episode because I was on a press trip with international journalists, and not all of them had the visas that they could cross over to the U.S. So we only did part of the train ride. But beautiful, beautiful area. And the history there is fascinating with the whole bringing everything, all the goods over the pass, and you have to bring a ton of supplies, and the whole story of the whole Yukon gold rush and how that was managed from the Canadian side is fascinating.
Yeah, I think they required that you had a year's worth of supplies you had to bring, because
That's right.
They had too many miners that were showing up that were ill-equipped, and then the Mounties would have to rescue them. And they were like, nope, we're not going to let that happen anymore.
Yeah, when you got to the top of the Chilkoot Pass, there were Mounties there with machine guns basically saying, nope, you don't have your 1,000 pounds, go back and get more, and you can't come in until you're ready.
But yeah, I would definitely recommend people check out these parks. I think that these are some of the best parks America has to offer, even if they don't necessarily get the most tourists. And there tends to be the big 3 parks, Yosemite, Yellowstone, and the Grand Canyon, are kind of thought of as the crown jewels. But I think a lot of these parks, especially like Gates of the Arctic, could easily be put in that same category. It's just that they aren't as well known and they don't get as many visitors.
And if I had to pin you down to the prettiest spot in Alaska's 8 national parks, where would you be standing and what would you be looking at?
Maybe watching bears catch fish in Katmai.
Okay.
Because that really is kind of impressive. And I could easily spend a full couple days just sitting with my camera doing that, or someplace flying over gates of the Arctic, because some of those mountains are really incredible. They're just really rugged and jagged, and you're not going to see anything else like that in the United States, really. Part of the Canadian Rockies kind of approach that, but in the U.S., the Rockies really aren't as kind of rugged as what you see in Canada. And the Brooks Range is the only place you're going to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent. One warning you would give before you go to one of these parks, you better make sure you bring
money. Alaska is not cheap.
Yep.
And flying, especially if it's flying, that's what's really going to set you back.
Yep.
As opposed to going to other parks. You can get in a car, you can drive to any national park in the US, you pay your entry fee, which is going to be $10 to $20. It's not that onerous, but flying into some of these parks really kind of changes the whole dynamic in terms of the cost. So I would definitely do your research, put in some time figuring out how much a lot of this costs so you can work a budget. I would not just show up unless money is not an issue. I wouldn't just show up and try to make it happen.
Okay. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Alaska's national parks.
When I went to Kobuk, they actually gave me a sign that said Kobuk Valley National Park so I could take a picture of it, because there are no signs in the park. So you had to literally fly in your own sign.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I did. Yeah, it was a wooden sign. It was actually like laser engraved. They did a really nice job with it, very light. And I brought it with me, and I took some pictures of Kobuk Valley with the Kobuk Valley sign. So if I wanted to use like an iconic photo, so I have a page on my website about Kobuk Valley, this is the only way you can know it's Kobuk Valley. Other than that, or just knowing that there are sand dunes in the north. And the one thing I forgot to mention, it can reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer on the sand dunes.
Get out.
Yes, because it's if you've ever been to Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, the temperature on those dunes can sometimes reach up to 150 degrees on the hottest days in the summer because it's reflecting so much heat. So in the middle of the day in Kobuk Valley, it can reach 100 degrees. And this is not necessarily global warming or anything. This is just the conditions on the dunes north of the Arctic Circle. Now, at night, it doesn't stay that warm, and the temperature can drop quite a bit because it doesn't hold a lot of heat. But during the day, it can reach 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Cool. Gary, if you had to summarize the 8 national parks in the U.S., what 3 words would you use?
Big.
Yep.
Remote. And beautiful.
Excellent. And if we're sending people to the best post you have on everything-everywhere.com about the Alaska National Parks, where are we sending them?
Hopefully I'll have it in the show notes. I basically have a single page devoted to all of the national parks in Alaska, and those will take you to individual pages for all of the parks that I have visited, and I am working on visiting all 24 of them in the Park Service in Alaska.
Excellent. And we'll find that in the show notes, and the show notes are also in the lyrics of this episode, as always, so you can always find the links for the things we talk about. Gary, thanks so much for coming back on the show. It's been so long since we have talked. We haven't talked since this morning, so I appreciate having a chance to get you back on. And whenever we have Gary on, you want to make sure you check out his site, or at least check out the version of this with photos, because Gary is an accomplished photographer, and you will find his photographs stunning, I am sure. Thanks so much for coming, Gary.
Thank you for having me.
In news of the community, since Gary was on, it seemed only appropriate to have a national park piece of feedback, and I heard from someone who works at the Lowell National Historic Site in Lowell, outside of Boston, Massachusetts. Phil sent me a picture of what I didn't know they have, which is national park quarters. So a regular quarter, a coin, and the back of the coin are a series of national parks, including one that is Lowell, Massachusetts. And he sent it to me because we had mentioned it on the recent show we had done on Boston, that I had recommended going to the Lowell Historic Park, which is where the Industrial Revolution in the United States starts. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com. And thanks so much for listening.
I got to see one more cathedral. I got to sit in one more cafe. I to